The UN Security Council is due to vote on a resolution calling for the suspension of hostilities in Gaza. The vote has already been delayed twice this week as diplomats have been negotiating with the United States on the wording of the resolution. Earlier this month, Washington vetoed a resolution calling for a ceasefire. The latest draft calls on the parties of the conflict in Gaza to comply with their obligations under international law regarding the protection of civilians. It also calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors throughout the Gaza Strip for a sufficient number of days to enable full, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. Additionally, it calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Let's bring in our correspondent, Gabriel Elizondo. He's joining us live from the UN headquarters in New York, and it's been delayed for days, Gabe. That gives us an idea of just how contentious the wording of this resolution has been, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And it just shows you how serious everyone is taking this resolution, given the situation and the humanitarian disaster, really, catastrophe that's playing out in Gaza right now. Things are moving very fast here at the United Nations. I'll start off by saying that. Let me just tell you initially what's going on right now. The Security Council members for the last half hour or a little bit more than that have been behind closed doors in what's called a closed session. They've been trying to hammer out some sort of agreement that the U.S. Can agree to, basically, on this draft resolution that has now been on the table for several days now. That closed-door meeting, we believe, has ended, and now we're waiting to find out if the ambassadors come back into the Security Council chambers and hold a vote or not. That is what we're waiting for literally at this very minute right now. The key here is not only the language is the key, but there's really two key parts. There's a suspension of hostilities. That was the first issue that the U.S. was kind of grappling with. Would they accept that? And the second is now this monitoring mechanism, we believe, could be a point of contention. In the draft resolution, it calls for a monitoring mechanism. Essentially, in short, what that means is it would mean empower the United Nations to facilitate the entry of aid into Gaza and then facilitate its distribution, essentially taking power away from the Israelis on that part there. So clearly the U.S. has some problems with this. And if you're asking yourself why this is important, is because the U.S. can veto this. And then it would stop any further movement on this resolution, of course. They're one of 5 countries with veto power, number one. But number two, why are these negotiations dragging on so long? The answer is, we believe, because this is so high profile, because the language is so important, because it is binding by international law. If it passes, we believe that the U.S. Ambassador to the UN is having to go to Washington, and ultimately any language would have to be signed off on by the White House. And so even if they perhaps agree to something here at the UN, meaning the U.S., to a draft, they've then got to go to Washington, we believe, to get sign off at the very highest of levels. And that clearly takes some time. But it also shows you how important every little word is in this resolution. And lastly, I'll say, this resolution has overwhelming support. We do think that it would pass with the 9 votes needed. Again, it now comes down to the United States. Would they abstain and let this go forward, or would they veto it? That's the big question.
And Gabe, we are hearing from the United Nations that the Security Council, that vote has been delayed to Thursday. It was supposed to take place on Monday. It is now supposed to take place on Thursday. Let's listen in to what's happening at the Security Council.
I think everyone wants to see a resolution that has impact and that is implementable on the ground, and there are some discussions going on about how to make that possible.
Madam Ambassador, are the discussions going on between Hamas, Egypt and Qatar impacting the decision to delay, and could that change the text of the resolution?
Those negotiations have been ongoing, stopping and starting since the start of this conflict following the 7th of October attack on Israel. Those conversations will continue. and they have not been raised in council deliberations. They are not part of our discussions on the text. That is responding to a humanitarian crisis that we have seen in Gaza, and with the backlog of humanitarian aid not able to reach Palestinian civilians on the ground in Gaza, that is the response that has been drafted by the council as a result in response to that. So, yeah.
I mean, compared to yesterday or the day before, are you more optimistic today?
I believe that capitals that have equities in this file are engaging at the highest level of diplomacy to reach a text that will have impact on the ground. Diplomacy takes time. It means evolving conversations, and people are giving it their attention at the highest levels of the capitals that have leverage on this. So I think from that sense, you have to be optimistic in diplomacy, otherwise we wouldn't all come into this building every day. In that sense, I am optimistic, but in another sense, if this fails, then we will continue to keep trying, because we have to keep trying. There is too much suffering on ground for the Council to continue to fail on this, and we haven't failed. We have a resolution, 2712. We need to build on that resolution, and I hope we will also adopt a humanitarian resolution that responds to the crisis on ground.
One more question, please, about your position in your national capacity about the role that the UN should take in monitoring the implementation of the resolution. Do you think that this should be a UN mission, or the UN should take should monitor the implementation, or other parties?
I think that the UN has one of the most trusted brand names globally. It has credibility and it has experience on the field. So I think the UN is the organization that we have for implementation, and I think countries in the region have come to the UN asking for their support in the face of this crisis. So this is a resolution that was born out of a conversation and discussions at the ministerial meeting in Riyadh. It is an Arab OIC discussion about the immense burden that regional countries and partners are facing in terms of scaling up humanitarian aid into Gaza, and in particular Egypt, which is why Security Council members, many of us incoming and present, went to the Rafah border crossing with Gaza last week and saw firsthand thousands of trucks and the convoys leading into Gaza that are unable to go in, medical equipment that is unable to go in, ambulances that are unable to evacuate wounded people. We met with wounded children in the Al Arish hospital. The Egyptians are doing a phenomenal job on the border of Gaza to try and support the Palestinian people, but this is also fundamentally needed to be supported by the United Nations and by all regional and international partners. So I think we do trust the UN to have a role here. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your patience. Yeah.
Regardless of what this diplomacy yields, will this still go to a vote?
This will go to a vote. The UAE's penholder will bring this resolution to a vote, and we hope for a resolution that has impact on the ground and is adopted.
Thank you. Do you expect 10 a.m.?
I expect in the morning.
So we have been listening there to the United Arab Emirates ambassador to the United Nations Security Council, Lara Nuseibeh, and she was speaking about that UN Security Council resolution that we have been expecting a vote on since Monday, and we have just heard that it's been delayed to Thursday now. She spoke of the backlog of humanitarian aid that's unable to reach people in Gaza. This resolution is calling for a suspension of hostilities in Gaza and also on speeding up and expanding humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Let's bring our correspondent Gabriel Elizondo back in. He's been listening in. He's live for us at UN headquarters in New York. And the UAE ambassador, of course, the United Arab Emirates, has sponsored this resolution. It is the only Arab member of the 15-member Security Council, Gabe. And Ms. Nuseibeh said that she is optimistic about this resolution, but if it fails, that they will continue with their efforts because there is too much suffering in Gaza.
Yeah, that's right. There are a couple of things she said there that were really key. At the end, she was asked, will there be a vote? And she said, yes, there will be a vote at some point. Will that vote be on Wednesday? It appears that's not the case now. It's being delayed again, we're told, until Thursday. She also said that There's been engagement at the highest levels of diplomacy. As I was mentioning before, when I was speaking to you a few moments ago, I was saying how we believe that at least with the U.S. side of this, they're having to get sign-off from the highest levels in Washington, D.C., even higher than the Secretary of State, perhaps going all the way to the President, Joe Biden, having to sign off on this resolution on how the U.S. would vote here at the Security Council. So it's clear now that both sides, and when I say both sides, let's be clear. What I mean by both sides is you have the U.S. clearly on one side, and you have the majority of the Security Council members on the other side that want to vote and that want to vote for this draft resolution, 4 pages, as it's written now. When I say the other side, I mean the United States, that is clearly the country that is holding this up, and clearly the country that is asking for delay after delay after delay to try to find some sort of compromise on a resolution they can vote for. I do not think the U.S. wants to use its veto power. It already has vetoed 2 other Security Council resolutions, one on October 18th that called for a humanitarian pause, another veto by the U.S. on December 8th that called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. If the U.S. was to veto another Security Council resolution on Gaza, especially this one that is entirely focused on humanitarian efforts, on scaling up humanitarian aid into Gaza for the people that need it the most, I think it's very well understood that the U.S. would lose a lot of goodwill, not only in the Security Council, but in the world more broadly. That is pretty much well accepted. So I think that the U.S. is being very cautious now. And when I mean cautious, I mean that's why this is having to go up to the highest levels of government at the U.S., because they know the ramifications of vetoing this, but they also know, the U.S., that they are Israel's main ally here, and they have been in lockstep, they meaning the United States, has been in lockstep with Israel since October 7th. These are the political dynamics, the diplomatic dynamics that you're seeing being played out in real time right now in the United Nations Security Council. But to recap, what you just heard from the ambassador, the UAE ambassador to the UN there, is she is expecting a vote on this, but now it's being delayed until at least Thursday, and she's confirming that there is still negotiations at the highest levels from the main countries involved in negotiating this draft resolution.
All right, Gabe, thank you very much for that. Gabriel Elizondo live at the UN headquarters in New York.